The morning Annie Covington's hand stopped shaking long enough to pour a steady cup of coffee was the same morning a stranger rode into Dusty Creek, Nevada, and changed every single thing she had ever believed about herself. It was the spring of 1878, and the town of Dusty Creek sat like a sun-bleached bone in the middle of the Nevada high desert, the kind of place that swallowed people whole and asked no apologies for it. The saloon was the tallest building on the main street, which said everything a person needed to know about the town's priorities. There was a general store, a livery stable, a small church that doubled as a schoolhouse on weekdays, and the Covington boarding house, which Annie ran entirely by herself from 4 in the morning until sometimes past midnight. Annie was 26 years old that spring, though she looked both older and younger than that depending on the light. In the gray pre-dawn, bent over a washboard in the yard behind the house, she looked older, her brown hair pinned back severely, her forearms red and rough from lye soap. But when the evening sun caught her in just the right slant, when she paused for half a breath at the kitchen window and let her guard down for just a moment, there was something in her face that was soft and wondering and entirely too young for the life she had been living. She had inherited the boarding house from her father, Clement Covington, who had died of a lung fever 2 years prior. Before that, she had inherited it from her mother, though her mother had never technically died. She had simply walked away one morning when Annie was 9 years old, leaving behind a note that said she was not made for this kind of life. Annie had never entirely forgiven her for that, though she understood it better with every passing year. The boarding house had 4 rooms. At any given time, those rooms held miners passing through on their way to the silver camps further west, traveling salesmen, the occasional family fleeing somewhere else. Annie cooked 3 meals a day, laundered linens twice a week, kept the accounts in a leather-bound ledger her father had started, repaired the roof when it leaked, replaced window glass when the wind took it, and smiled at the guests because smiling kept them from complaining, and complaints meant refunds, and refunds meant she didn't eat. She had been doing this for so long that she had almost forgotten it was a choice. Almost, but not quite. On quiet Sunday afternoons, when the guests were at the church she could not afford to attend because someone had to stay and watch the house, she would sit on the back steps with a cup of coffee that was already going cold, and she would look out at the desert scrub and the distant mountains, and she would feel something hollow moving through her chest. It wasn't exactly sadness. It was more like the memory of a want she had once had and could no longer name. Aaron Malone rode into Dusty Creek on a Thursday. She heard him before she saw him, because the horse he was riding had a loose shoe, and it clicked against the hard-packed earth of Main Street in an uneven rhythm that was different from the usual afternoon traffic. She was sweeping the front porch when she looked up and saw a man on a roan quarter horse coming down the street at an easy walk, sitting straight in the saddle the way men sat who had spent their whole lives riding and didn't even think about it anymore. He was not what she would have called handsome in any obvious way. He was tall and lean, with dark hair that was a little too long, curling just behind his ears, and a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in perhaps a week. He wore a plain brown coat and a hat that had seen considerable weather, and his saddlebags were full enough that the horse shifted under their weight. He looked like 100 other men who had ridden through Dusty Creek. He looked like no one at all. But then he pulled up in front of the boarding house and he took off his hat and he looked at Annie directly, which most men did not do. Most men looked somewhere past her left shoulder when they spoke to her, or at the sign above the porch, or at some middle distance that permitted them to address her without actually seeing her. This man looked at her the way you looked at something you were genuinely curious about, with an open, unhurried attention. "Ma'am," he said, "I'm looking for a room. Are you the proprietor?" "I am," Annie said. She held the broom handle in both hands and felt the familiar straightening of her spine that happened when a potential guest arrived, the automatic assembly of the professional version of herself. Annie Covington. I have 2 rooms available at 75 cents a night or $4 for the week, which includes breakfast and dinner." He nodded slowly, considering this. "I'd like the week if you'll have me. I'll need the $4 up front." "Fair enough." He swung down from the horse with the ease of a man who had done that 10,000 times, landed lightly, and patted the horse's neck before he reached into his coat pocket and produced a small coin purse. He counted out the dollars carefully. "I'd also ask where a man might get his horse seen to. That shoe has been bothering us both since Elko." "Livery stable is at the far end of the street," Annie said. "Tell Dutch the horse is boarding with Covington and he'll bill me. It comes out of your deposit." He paused at that. "I didn't give you a deposit." "You will," she said, and she held out her hand for the coins. He looked at her for just a moment, and then something shifted in his expression that she could not quite read. Not amusement exactly, something quieter than that. He placed the coins in her palm and said, "Aaron Malone, ma'am. I'll be back directly." She watched him lead the horse down the street, which she told herself was just standard vigilance regarding a new guest and had nothing to do with anything else whatsoever. His name, it turned out, was exactly what he was. She learned this over the next several days the way you learned things about the people who moved through your house in fragments, overheard or offered. Never quite the whole picture, but enough to sketch the shape of a person. He was from Texas originally, from a place near San Antonio. He was 30 years old. He had spent the last several years as a range detective, which was a polite term for a man hired by cattle associations to investigate rustling and other losses, and he had recently concluded a job in Elko that had apparently gone well enough, but left him tired in a way that he seemed to carry in his shoulders. He was in Dusty Creek because he was on his way to Carson City, where there was possibly another job waiting, but he had decided to stop for a week and rest because, as he told old Mr. Hennessy at the dinner table on his second night, a man who didn't occasionally rest made poor decisions, and poor decisions in his line of work tended to be permanent. He was quiet at meals. Not unfriendly, he spoke when spoken to, answered questions fully and without evasion, laughed when something was genuinely funny, which Annie noticed was not as often as most men pretended. He was simply a person who did not feel the need to fill silence with noise, and that alone set him apart from nearly every other guest she had ever housed. He also, and this was the thing she noticed most acutely, said please and thank you in ways that sounded like he meant them. That sounds like a small thing. It was not a small thing. In 2 years of running the boarding house on her own, Annie had learned that most people who stayed there viewed her as a mechanism. Not unkindly, she didn't think most of them were deliberately cruel. They were simply people who needed a service, and she provided the service, and the transaction was complete. They no more thought about whether she was tired or sad or wanted something for herself than they thought about whether the iron stove wanted something. She kept the stove fed, and it gave them heat. She kept herself fed, and she gave them clean sheets and hot food and a front desk that was always staffed. Aaron Malone said please and thank you, and he looked at her when he said them, and 3 days into his stay she caught herself staying a little longer at the dinner table after the other guests had gone, just to see if he would stay too. He did. "You cook everything yourself?" he asked on the 3rd evening. The other 2 current guests, a pair of mining surveyors named Beaumont and Greer, had gone off to the saloon, which was their preferred after-dinner activity. The lamp on the sideboard was burning low and warm, and the desert night had started pressing in cold against the windows. "Everything," she said. She was stacking dishes at the end of the table, which was her standard departure maneuver, the thing that said the conversation was pleasant but there was work to do. "You make that bread yourself too?" "I do. It's the best bread I've had since Texas." He said it simply, without embellishment or the performance of flattery. She stopped stacking dishes and looked at him. "You don't have to say that." "I know," he said. "I wouldn't have said it if I didn't mean it." He turned his coffee cup slowly in his hands, a habit she had already noticed, that circular turning motion he did when he was thinking. "How long have you been running this place?" 2 years alone," she said. My whole life before that, alongside my father. He nodded. He did not say things like that must be hard or you're doing a remarkable job the way people sometimes said, meaning well but landing the words like a kind of gentle pity. He just absorbed the information and let the silence hold it. What did you want to be? He asked. She blinked. The question landed somewhere unexpected. I beg your pardon. When you were young, he said, before all this, what did you want? Annie looked at him for a long moment. She tried to remember the last time someone had asked her that. She could not recall a single instance. Guests asked her how much the rooms were, whether she could do laundry if there was a bathtub available on Fridays. Her father had asked her to take the firewood in, to help with the linens, to take over the accounts when his eyes got bad. The people of Dusty Creek asked her to bake a pie for the church social, to take in old Mrs. Radnor's mending, to sit with whatever child had a fever because Annie always knew what to do with a child who had a fever. No one asked her what she wanted. I don't remember, she said, and she picked up the stack of dishes and carried them to the kitchen, and she told herself it was the warmth of the stove that made her eyes sting. The first time she saw Aaron Malone in difficulty was on his 5th day. He had been out riding most of the day, which was his habit. He seemed to think better on horseback, or perhaps he just needed the movement, the particular meditation of a long ride through open country. He came back in the late afternoon with dust on his coat and a look about him that she had not seen before, something tight and controlled and carefully maintained. She was in the small sitting room off the entry hall, mending a curtain by the window, when she heard him come in. She heard the particular sound of a man who was hurting trying not to let anyone know he was hurting, the slightly too careful footsteps, the breath held a moment too long. She put down the curtain and went to the entry hall. He was standing at the foot of the stairs with one hand on the newel post and his head slightly bowed, and there was a tear in his coat sleeve and blood on his forearm that he was pressing with his other hand. What happened? She said, and she said it in the tone she used with injured minors and frightened children, which was flat and practical and left no room for pride. He looked up. There was a flash of something embarrassment perhaps, or frustration at being caught in a moment of vulnerability, and then he let it go. Horse spooked at a rattler. I came off. I'm fine. You're bleeding. I know I'm bleeding. Sit down, she said, pointing to the straight-back chair by the door. He sat. He was not the kind of man who argued with a direct instruction, which she appreciated. She went to the kitchen and came back with the medical tin she kept under the sink, which held clean linen strips, carbolic acid, a needle and thread, and a small bottle of whiskey that she kept strictly for antiseptic purposes, and which she had never in 2 years been tempted to drink for any other reason, because she simply did not have time to be drunk. She knelt beside the chair, and he turned his arm toward her without being asked. The wound was a long scrape rather than a cut, raw and dirty with desert grit. It needed cleaning, not stitching, which was a relief. This is going to sting, she said. All right, he said. She poured the carbolic, and he didn't flinch, which told her he had been hurt before and knew how to be still with pain. She worked quickly and carefully, and when she was done she wrapped the arm in linen and tied it off. Thank you, he said. And then, after a pause, I'm sorry to be trouble. She sat back on her heels and looked up at him, and the angle of it, looking up at a man who was looking down at her with an expression that was genuinely sorry for inconveniencing her, caught her off guard in some way she couldn't immediately account for. You're not trouble, she said. Miss Covington, he said, and his voice had something in it that was careful. You've been on your feet since before dawn. I watched you through the kitchen window this morning when I came down early. It was not yet 4 o'clock and you were already working. She felt a strange prickling at the back of her throat. That's just how it is. Does it have to be? She stood up and began putting things back in the tin. Someone has to do it. Does it have to be you, all of it, all the time? She snapped the tin closed. Yes, she said, more sharply than she intended. Yes, it does. Because there's no one else. She picked up the tin and walked back to the kitchen, and she stood at the sink for a moment with both hands flat on the wooden counter, and she breathed until the sharpness passed. She didn't know why his question had affected her that way. It was simple enough. It was a reasonable enough thing to wonder, but it had reached into something she kept very carefully closed and pressed on it, and that was uncomfortable in a way that felt almost like anger, though she knew it wasn't quite that. She heard him on the stairs, heard him go to his room, heard the door close. She stood at the sink until the water in the kettle began to steam, and then she made herself a cup of tea she barely tasted and went back to her mending, and said nothing to herself about anything at all. The following morning, a Saturday, Annie came downstairs at her usual time and found the kitchen fire already lit. She stood in the kitchen doorway and stared at it. The fire was lit and banked properly. The kettle was on, and there was a small stack of fresh wood beside the stove that she had not put there. She stood in her kitchen and looked at this and felt something so strange and disorienting move through her that she had to hold onto the door frame. Aaron Malone was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, reading a newspaper that was 3 weeks old, the way all newspapers in Dusty Creek were, because that was how long it took the stage to bring them from Sacramento. He looked up. "Morning," he said. He was utterly calm, as though sitting in someone else's kitchen at 4 in the morning was entirely unremarkable. "You lit my fire," she said. "I was up," he said. "Figured it would save you a few minutes." She looked at him. She looked at the fire. She looked at the kettle, already beginning to hiss. She opened her mouth and then closed it because she did not know what to say to this. No one had ever lit her kitchen fire. That was her task. It had always been her task. It would always be her task. The idea that someone had simply done it without being asked, without wanting anything in return, without even particularly wanting thanks. "Sit down," he said, in a tone that was the same flat, practical, no-argument tone she had used with him the evening before. "Have a cup of coffee first." She sat. She did not know why she sat. She was not the kind of woman who sat when there was work to do. But she sat, and he poured her coffee from the pot he had apparently already made, and she wrapped both hands around the cup and looked at the fire and thought about nothing. After a while he said, quietly, "What would you stop doing if you could stop anything?" She turned to look at him. "I mean it," he said. "Of all the things you do every single day, if you could hand one of them to someone else and never do it again, what would it be?" The question was so simple. It was such a simple, direct, entirely manageable question. She had answered harder questions. She had answered questions about roof repair and grain prices, and the appropriate amount of lye for a large laundry load. She had answered questions from men twice her age who thought they knew more than she did. She had answered questions in the middle of the night when guests knocked because they couldn't sleep or had a headache or simply wanted company. But this question, she opened her mouth. She tried to find a practical answer, something that would deflect the weight of what he was actually asking. The accounts, she almost said. Or the laundry, something manageable. But what came out was nothing at first, and then something that wasn't a word at all, and then, to her absolute horror and shame, she began to cry. Not crying the way a person cries when something sad happens, not neatly or gracefully. She cried the way a person cries when something true is touched after being hidden so long that the touching of it is itself unbearable. It came out of her like something that had been sealed under pressure, and she pressed both hands over her mouth and stared at the table and shook with it. Aaron Malone did not say anything. He did not reach across and pat her hand in the awkward, placating way that people patted hands. He did not stand up and leave, which would have been easier for both of them. He just stayed where he was, on the other side of the table, and he let her cry, and somehow the steadiness of his presence was the most extraordinary thing anyone had ever given her. When it passed, she lowered her hands and looked at the tabletop. Her face felt hot. She felt exposed in a way that was almost physical. "I'm sorry," she said. "Don't be," he said. "I don't know why She stopped. "You don't have to explain it," he said. "You've been carrying a tremendous amount for a very long time, and someone asked you what you wanted and you wept. That's not something to apologize for, Miss Covington. That's something to pay attention to." She raised her eyes to his face. He was watching her with that same open, unhurried attention. and there was nothing in his expression except a kind of serious, clear-eyed care that she had never seen directed at her before. Not pity, not performance, just actual, genuine regard. "The accounts," she said finally. He tilted his head slightly. "You asked what I'd stop doing," she said. "The accounts, I hate the accounts. I've always hated them. My father loved them. They made sense to him. Numbers in columns, debits and credits. He could look at a ledger page and feel satisfied. I look at them and feel like I'm drowning." She laughed, a little unsteady. "It's a stupid thing to say. They're just numbers." "It's not stupid at all," he said. "What would you do instead?" She looked at him. "What do you mean?" "If you had the time you spend on the accounts back, the hour or two every week, what would you do with it?" She thought about it. She thought about it genuinely, which was unusual. "I used to draw," she said very quietly, as though the admission required a low voice to survive. "When I was young, before my mother left, before things got so busy, I used to draw pictures of the mountains, of the desert, just with pencil, nothing fancy, but I liked it." She shook her head. "That's not useful." "Why does it have to be useful?" he asked. She looked at him for a long time. The kitchen fire crackled. The kettle whispered. Outside the boarding house, Dusty Creek was still entirely asleep. "I don't know," she said. "I don't know why it has to be useful. It just always has had to be." He nodded. He turned his coffee cup in that slow, circular way. "My mother made quilts," he said. "Spent half her life making quilts. My father thought it was a waste of time because we had plenty of blankets and didn't need more. But she made them anyway. When she died, there were 43 quilts folded in the cedar chest at the foot of their bed, and my father cried over every one of them because each one was 43 moments of her being herself, not someone useful, just herself." He looked up at her. "That's worth more than the accounts." Annie pressed her lips together. She looked down at her coffee. "You're a strange man, Mr. Malone," she said, and her voice was not unkind. "So I've been told," he said and smiled. And it was the first full smile she had seen from him, and it changed his face considerably. She smiled back, and it surprised her when she did it, because the smile was real. She couldn't remember the last time she had smiled at the breakfast table and meant it. The mining surveyors, Beaumont and Greer, departed that Saturday afternoon. They shook Annie's hand and told her the house was very fine and paid their bill and rode off toward the silver camps in the northeast. And Annie stripped their linens and washed them and hung them in the afternoon sun, and tried not to think about the fact that, for the next several days, it would be just herself and Aaron Malone under the roof of the boarding house. She told herself this was a straightforward logistical observation and had no particular significance. She started a new batch of bread that evening, and she found herself paying attention to the process in a way she normally didn't, noticing the texture of the dough under her hands, the warmth of the kitchen, the good smell of yeast and flour. She thought about what Aaron had said about his mother's quilts, and she needed the bread, and she thought about 43 quilts folded in a cedar chest, all of them proof that a woman had once been someone separate from her usefulness. He knocked on the kitchen door frame at 7 o'clock. "I can take your dinner dishes down to the pump if you like," he said. "You're a paying guest," she said. "You don't need to do dishes." "I know I don't need to," he said. "I want to." She looked at him with her flour-covered hands, and she thought about arguing, and then she thought about his mother's quilts, and she said, "Thank you." He took the dishes down. He washed them at the pump in the yard, which was more work than taking them to the kitchen sink, and he brought them back dry and stacked them on the kitchen shelf. She watched this through the window over the sink, and she felt the hollow place in her chest do something unfamiliar. It contracted a little, or perhaps it was expanding. She wasn't certain she knew the difference. Sunday was quiet. The town's population, such as it was, went to church in the morning, and afterwards gathered in clusters in front of the general store or the saloon to exchange the week's news. Annie made a large pot of soup that would do for 2 meals and sat down on the back steps in the afternoon with her coffee and the desert and the distant mountains. Aaron came and sat on the step below her, not asking permission, not making a show of it, just sitting. He had his hat in his hands, and his face turned up toward the mountains, and they sat in silence for a while that was comfortable in a way she couldn't explain, because she had never found silence with another person comfortable before. Silence with other people always felt like something she needed to fill. "How long have you been a range detective?" she asked. "7 years," he said. "Started when I was 23. Spent a year on a cattle drive out of Texas before that, and a year before that working horse farms in New Mexico. I've been moving more or less constantly since I was 18. "Don't you want to stop?" He was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking about it," he said. "What would you do instead?" He smiled at her, and she realized what she had done turned his own question back on him. The smile said he recognized it too. "I'd like land," he said. "I've always wanted land of my own. Not a cattle empire, nothing that large. A smaller spread, good grass, access to water, a place I could come back to." He paused. "A place worth coming back to." "Nevada is good land," she said. "In the right places." "I've noticed," he said. He looked at her sideways. "I've been particularly noticing the last few days." She felt warmth move across her face that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun, and she looked away toward the mountains and made a project of drinking her coffee. He did not press it. He didn't push. He just sat there on the step below her with his hat in his hands and let the afternoon be what it was. On Monday morning, Annie came downstairs to find the fire already lit again. She stood in the doorway and looked at it and felt something in her chest that was bright and aching at the same time. He was not in the kitchen this morning. She heard him upstairs moving around, getting ready for the day, and she made her coffee and stood at the window and watched the dawn come up over the eastern ridgeline, purple and gold. And she thought about the drawing she had once done of a sunrise behind those exact mountains, when she was 12 years old and her mother was still there, and the boarding house was still primarily her father's problem, and she had been, for a few brief years, allowed to be just a child. She went to the small writing desk in the corner of the sitting room where she kept her account ledger. She opened the bottom drawer and rummaged past the ledger and the box of pen nibs and the tin of India ink, and at the very back of the drawer, under a folded piece of old newspaper, she found what she was looking for. A worn pencil, flat and gray, its point still intact. She held it in her hand for a long moment. Then she put it in her apron pocket. She didn't draw anything that morning, but she kept the pencil in her pocket all day, and every once in a while she put her hand in her pocket and felt it there. And the feeling was something she didn't have a word for, but that she thought might be adjacent to hope. Aaron went into town in the morning to the general store for some tobacco and came back in the afternoon with, inexplicably, a box of drawing pencils, which he set on the kitchen table beside her coffee cup without comment and walked back out to see to his horse. Annie stood and looked at the box of pencils for a full minute. They were good pencils, 6 of them in a paper sleeve, the kind you could order from a catalog. They would have cost him perhaps 30 cents. It was not a large sum. It was not a small gesture. She picked up the box and held it in both hands and looked out the kitchen window at the stable yard where she could see him brushing down the roan horse with long, even strokes. He was not watching to see her reaction. He was just tending to his horse. She sat down at the kitchen table and opened the box and took out one pencil and opened the blank page at the back of her account ledger, the page she'd always thought of as waste space, and she drew the outline of the mountains as she could see them through the kitchen window, just the ridge and the sky above it, nothing elaborate. Her hand was uncertain at first, the way a hand is when it remembers something long unused. But the line came. She drew for 20 minutes before she remembered the dinner potatoes. 20 minutes was the longest she had done something purely for herself, something with no practical application, in longer than she could remember. Her face was flushed when Aaron came in from the stable yard, and she closed the ledger quickly, and he noticed, but he didn't say anything about it. He washed his hands at the kitchen pump and said, "What's for dinner?" As though everything were entirely ordinary, and she was grateful for his tact in a way that sat in her chest like a small, warm stone. The week was supposed to end on Thursday. On Wednesday evening, After a dinner that was just the two of them and that had stretched to 2 hours because the conversation kept opening new rooms, Annie was washing the dishes and Aaron was drying them, which had become a habit neither of them had formally established but which had simply begun happening, and he said, "I've been thinking about staying another week." She kept her eyes on the dish she was washing. "The rooms are available," she said. "That's not why I'd stay," he said. She looked at him then. He was holding the dish towel and looking at her with an expression that was plain and unguarded and serious. "Mr. Malone," she said. "Aaron," he said, "please." She felt her hand still in the water. "Aaron," she said, and the word felt different in her mouth than the formal address had, closer and warmer. "I'm not a woman who has a great deal of practice with this." "I know that," he said. "I'm not in any hurry. You're on your way to Carson City." "I was on my way to Carson City," he said. "That was before. The job can wait. The job is almost certainly going to present itself again whether I arrive this week or next month. Jobs like that always do." He set the dish towel down on the counter. "What won't wait is this. Whatever this is, I'd like to find out what it is if you'll let me." She stood at the sink with her wet hands and her heart doing something erratic, and she thought about her mother walking away, about the note that said she was not made for this kind of life. She thought about 2 years alone and 4 years before that helping her father while he was sick, and every sunrise she had watched by herself, and every cup of coffee she had drunk cold because there was always something that needed doing before she could sit down. "All right," she said. "Stay another week." He smiled. Not the wide, full smile, something quieter, something that sat in his eyes. "Thank you," he said. They finished the dishes. He said good night at the kitchen door. She stood at the sink after he went upstairs and pressed her wet hand flat against her collarbone and felt her own heartbeat, fast and certain, and she thought, so that is what that feels like. The second week was different from the first. In the first week she had been observing him the way she observed all guests, cataloging his habits and needs, learning the shape of him as a practical matter. In the second week, she found herself observing him the way you observe something that astonishes you, with a quality of attention that was not professional at all. She noticed the way he listened. When she spoke, even about small things, about a repair needed on the porch rail, about the difficulty of keeping the linens white in the desert heat, about a funny thing that Mrs. Radnor from across the street had said that morning, he listened as though the thing she was saying was worth hearing. Not performing interest, actually interested. It was disorienting in the best possible way. She noticed his hands. He had the hands of a man who worked hard, calloused, and capable, but they were also precise hands, hands that moved with care when they needed to. He repaired the porch rail without being asked, on a Tuesday afternoon, while she was inside making bread. She came out to call him in for coffee and found him finishing the last board, fitting it into place with a level and 2 nails, and she stood in the doorway and watched his hands work and felt something warm and complicated move through her. She noticed the way he was with the horse. The roan's name was Bishop, and he loved that horse the way some men loved their families, with a practical, steady tenderness that didn't make a show of itself. He talked to Bishop in a low voice when he groomed him, and he always made sure the horse was fed before himself. She noticed that when she laughed, and she was laughing more that week than she had in a considerable time, he looked genuinely pleased. Not in the preening way of a man who has made a woman laugh to prove something, just pleased, the way you are pleased when something good happens to someone you care about. On Thursday afternoon, the day his second week technically began, he asked her to show him her drawing. "It's nothing," she said. "Let me see it anyway," he said. She hesitated, then retrieved the account ledger from the writing desk and opened it to the back page. She held it out to him and looked away. She heard him be quiet with it for a moment. "Annie," he said. The use of her given name for the first time made her look up. He was looking at the drawing with an expression that was not polite appreciation. He was genuinely looking at it, the way she had seen him look at the mountains from the back steps, with real attention. "This is extraordinary," he said. "It's just a sketch." "It's a sketch that looks exactly like those mountains," he said. to a degree that suggests you've been seeing them very clearly for a very long time." He looked up at her. "How many years have you been looking at those mountains without drawing them?" 15, she said. He handed the ledger back. "Don't wait another 15, he said. She took the ledger and held it. "The pencils helped," she said. "The ones you brought." "Good," he said. He turned back to the coffee he had been pouring at the sideboard, and it was that, the way he didn't make a large thing of having given her something, the way the gift had been given and received and now simply existed between them without ceremony, that made her throat tighten in the way it had been doing more and more frequently in his presence. Not the miserable kind of tightening, the other kind. On Friday evening, a man named Garrett Sloane arrived at the boarding house. Sloane was a land agent from Carson City, heavyset and prosperous-looking, with a mustache he clearly considered distinguished. He wanted a room for 2 nights, which Annie provided. Sloane ate dinner with them and talked a great deal about the current land situation in western Nevada and the extraordinary investment opportunities available in the region. And he told Annie, with the particular confidence of a man who assumed his opinions were welcome, that she was running this property below its potential value, and that she ought to consider selling to a larger hospitality operation that he happened to represent. "Thank you for your thoughts," Annie said. "I'm serious, Miss Covington," Sloane said. He leaned forward. "You're a young woman managing a 4-room boarding house on your own. That's admirable, truly. But think of what you could do if you sold and took that capital east. Start fresh somewhere, find a husband, settle properly." He smiled the smile of a man who thought he was being helpful. Annie folded her hands on the table. "I appreciate the perspective," she said. "But this house was my father's and his father's before him, and I'm not interested in selling." "The market won't always, Mr. Sloane," Aaron said, very quietly. Sloane looked at him. "Miss Covington has answered your question," Aaron said. He said it without heat, without aggression, just with the same flat certainty with which he did everything. Several times, in fact. Sloane looked between them, recalibrated something, and said, of course, forgive me." He turned the conversation to mining speculation for the remainder of the meal. After dinner, when Sloane had retired and Annie was in the kitchen, Aaron appeared in the doorway. "I should have let you handle him," he said. "That wasn't my place." She turned from the stove. "I was managing him fine," she said. "You were," he agreed. I didn't like the way he was looking at you when he said the part about finding a husband." He paused. "That was a personal reaction, not a practical one. I apologize if it was unwelcome." She studied him. "It wasn't unwelcome," she said carefully. He nodded. He turned the coffee cup in his hand. "Good," he said very quietly, and went to bed. She stood at the stove and smiled at the wall until the smile got too big for her to maintain a sensible expression, and she had to press her hand over her mouth to contain it. Sloane left on Sunday morning, which was a relief to everyone, including, Annie suspected, Sloane himself, who seemed to sense that he had miscalculated his audience. That Sunday afternoon, Aaron brought his bedroll out to the back steps and set it in the yard for airing, and while he was out there, he spread it on the ground and sat on it and said, "Come sit." She sat beside him on the bedroll in the afternoon sun. They were close, the way you are close to someone when you sit on the same surface in a yard, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his arm near hers without touching. "Can I tell you something?" he said. "Yes," she said. "I came through Dusty Creek because I needed to rest," he said. "That's the truth. But I've been restless my whole adult life, and I know the difference between the kind of rest you get by stopping moving and the kind of rest you get by finding something worth stopping for." He looked at her. "I've been here 2 weeks and I haven't been restless once, not for a single hour. Not since the morning I found your kitchen fire was cold and I lit it, and you came downstairs and looked at it and looked at me, and for one moment looked surprised that anyone would do something for you." She felt the familiar threat of tears and pressed it down by looking at her hands. "I know this is fast," he said. "I know we've known each other 2 weeks. I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give. But I want to be honest with you, because you've been honest with me in ways you probably didn't intend to be, and I think you deserve someone who tells you the truth about what they're feeling instead of managing you." She looked up at that. Managing you. The word hit something precise. That was exactly the right word for most of the ways people had communicated with her throughout her life. They had managed her, directed her, utilized her. They had not told her the truth about anything. "What are you feeling?" she asked, and her voice was steady, which she was proud of. "I'm feeling like I've been riding toward something for 7 years without knowing what it was," he said. "And I think this might be it. You might be it." He paused. "I think you're remarkable, Annie. Not because of what you do, though what you do is extraordinary. Because of who you are underneath all of it. Because of the way you weep when someone finally asks you what you want. Because the wanting has been stored up so long that it comes out like a flood. Because of the mountains you draw on the back page of your account ledger when you think no one is paying attention. Because you wept and then you put your chin up and answered the question anyway." He stopped. "That's what I'm feeling." Annie sat in the afternoon sun on a bedroll in the yard behind her father's boarding house, and she felt something shift inside her that she did not think was going to shift back. Something fundamental, tectonic, the rearrangement of a load she had been carrying in a way that had not served her. "I'm feeling," she said slowly, working her way through it, "that I've spent my whole life being valued for what I can do, not who I am, what I can do. And the terrifying thing about what you just said is that I'm not sure I know the difference anymore. I'm not sure who I am outside of what I do." She stopped. "That's an honest answer." "It is," he said. "And for what it's worth, I think finding out who you are outside of what you do sounds like the most important project there is, and I would very much like to be here while you do it." She looked at him for a long moment. "Stay another week," she said. "I planned on it," he said. She laughed, sudden and real, and he laughed too, and the sound of their two laughs together in the quiet Sunday yard was one of the nicest things she had ever heard. 2 more guests arrived on Monday, a family of 5, a husband and wife and 3 young children, passing through on their way west to California. The wife, whose name was Clara, was hollow-eyed with exhaustion, and the children were fractious, and the husband was doing that particular kind of well-meaning helplessness that men did when they didn't know how to help their wives. Annie took one look at Clara and showed her upstairs to their 2 adjoining rooms and told her to lie down while Annie watched the children for an hour. Aaron was in the sitting room when Annie came back downstairs with all 3 children behind her. He looked up from the newspaper. He looked at the children. He looked at Annie. He said, "I can keep them in the yard if you need your kitchen." "You don't," she began. "I want to," he said, in the tone that meant the conversation was already decided. She watched out the kitchen window while she made dinner, and he sat in the yard with the 3 children. The oldest was perhaps 8, the youngest perhaps 3, and showed them things about the roan horse through the stable fence, and let the youngest one sit on his shoulders, and played some version of a game that seemed to involve sticks and a circle drawn in the dirt. He was entirely easy with them, entirely unperformed, and the children, sensing this, were easy with him in return. Clara came down after an hour looking considerably restored and found Annie alone in the kitchen and said, "Your husband is wonderful with the children." "He's not my husband," Annie said. Clara looked at her, then looked out the window at Aaron in the yard, then looked back at Annie with an expression that was knowing and warm. "Yet," she said. Annie looked at the window. Clara said, "I don't mean to pry. I've just been married 8 years and I know that look." "What look?" Annie said. "The look," Clara said, "of a woman who has recently discovered that someone sees her, actually sees her, not as a function, not as a role, just her." She smiled, soft and a little sad and a little joyful at once. "It changes everything." Annie turned back to the stove. "I'll have dinner ready at 6, she said, and Clara was tactful enough to let the subject drop, though she was smiling when she turned away. That evening after dinner, after the children were put to bed and their parents were settled, Annie sat at the kitchen table with the account ledger and opened it to the back page. She drew for an hour, not the mountains this time but the yard, the fence line, the stable, the shape of the back steps. She drew Aaron's hat, which was hanging on the peg by the kitchen door, with all the specificity of a shape she had been looking at for 3 weeks and had memorized without realizing she was doing it. She looked at the hat drawing for a long time. Then she looked at her hands. Then she closed the ledger and went to bed and lay awake for a while thinking about being seen. The family left on Wednesday. The house was quiet again. Aaron found Annie in the sitting room that evening. She was at the writing desk with the ledger, genuinely doing the accounts this time, the hated columns, and he sat in the armchair by the window and said, "I have a proposal." She looked up. "A practical one," he said. "Don't worry." She raised one eyebrow. "What if I did the accounts?" he said. She stared at him. "You know bookkeeping." "My mother made sure of it," he said. She said it was the most important skill a person could have and that ranchers who didn't do their own books always ended up either broke or cheated. She was right. I've kept my own accounts for years and I find I don't mind them. Numbers in columns make sense to me. He paused. "You said the accounts were the thing you'd stop doing if you could stop anything." "I said that 3 weeks ago," she said. "I've been thinking about it since," he said. She looked at the ledger, then back at him. "You're a paying guest, not an employee." "What if I wasn't a paying guest?" he said. She went very still. "What if," he said, carefully choosing the words, "I were something else? What if this were my house too?" He looked at her steadily. "I'm aware that's a larger question than just the accounts. I'm asking it anyway because I am not a man who does things by half measures and I think you've had enough of people who do." Annie put her pen down very precisely on the desk. "Aaron," she said, "I want to be very sure we're talking about the same thing." "I think we are," he said. "I've been running this house alone for 2 years," she said. I don't know how to be a person who doesn't run things alone. I'm not sure I know how to want something for myself in the way you're talking about." "I know that," he said. "That's not a problem. That's something we figure out together slowly at whatever pace you need." She looked at him for a long time. The lamp was burning between them and outside the night was full of stars and the desert was silent and breathing. "What if you decide you don't want to stay?" she said. "What if Carson City calls you back, or Texas, or wherever? What if you ride out one morning and don't come back?" The question was not a small one. She heard her mother in it, the note on the kitchen table, not made for this kind of life. He leaned forward in the armchair with his elbows on his knees, and he looked at her directly and he said, "I've been riding away from things my whole life, Annie. I've been riding away from Texas, from jobs that finished, from towns that got too small, from people who wanted me to be more fixed than I knew how to be. But I've never felt what I feel when I ride back into Dusty Creek after a morning out. The feeling of coming back to somewhere." He paused. "I ride out in the morning and all I think about is coming back. That's new for me. That's entirely new." Annie felt tears rise again and she pressed them down with considerable effort. "You make me cry," she said with some exasperation. He smiled. "I've noticed. It's inconvenient. It seems to me," he said, "that it's not that I make you cry. It's that you've been not crying for a very long time and now you have someone to not cry in front of and the effort is a little much." She laughed at that, slightly waterlogged. She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes for a moment, then she looked at him. "Ask me again in a month," she said. "Ask me the same question in a month." "All right," he said. He sat back. "But I'm staying the month." "I know," she said. And she smiled at him across the lamplight, and he smiled back, and she thought about Clara's word "yet," and she thought it had a good sound to it. The month that followed was the most peculiar and illuminating stretch of time Annie could recall. Aaron stayed as promised. He began doing the accounts with a neatness and efficiency that made Annie faintly resentful because it looked so easy in his hands, the columns sliding into order without effort, the numbers adding cleanly. He did it in an hour on Sunday evenings and set the ledger on the desk, and that was that. And Annie had an hour of Sunday returned to her that she hadn't had in years. She spent the first Sunday of it sitting with the account ledger open to the back pages, drawing. She drew for an hour and then felt guilty about it, a specific guilt that said she should be doing something productive. And she sat with the guilt for about 5 minutes and then drew for another 30 minutes anyway and was pleased with herself for doing it. She began leaving the pencils on the kitchen windowsill. Not in the drawer, not out of sight. On the windowsill, where the light was good, where she could see them when she came in at 4 in the morning to light the stove. After a week she bought a proper sketchbook from the general store, a small one, gray-covered. She felt slightly ridiculous buying it. She bought it anyway. Aaron watched all of this without comment but with an attentiveness that she was increasingly aware of. He noticed when she had been drawing, she could tell, there was something in his expression when he saw the pencil shavings on the kitchen table, not satisfaction exactly, something quieter and more private than satisfaction. Like a man watching something grow. She noticed him beginning to be something other than a guest. He fixed the pump in the yard, which had been sticking. He replaced 2 window sashes that had been drafty. He repaired the chimney flashing on a hot September afternoon, which was a dangerous and unnecessary thing to do, and she stood at the bottom of the ladder and told him so, and he said he was perfectly fine, and she told him that was not the point, and he said he'd be careful, and she stood there with her hands on her hips until he came down again. She realized, standing at the bottom of that ladder, that she was frightened on his behalf, and that being frightened on someone's behalf was not the same as obligation, and was in fact considerably more uncomfortable. "You scared me," she said when he was down. He looked at her. "The chimney flashing was pulling away from the brickwork," he said. "If I'd left it another winter it would have let water in." "I know," she said. "I was going to fix it." "I know you were," he said. "I wanted to do it." He paused. "Did I scare you?" "Yes," she said. He stepped toward her then, and for the first time since he had arrived in Dusty Creek he was close to her, properly close, closer than the distance maintained by the polite transactions of innkeeper and guest. He was close enough that she had to look up at his face. "I'm sorry," he said. "I wasn't trying to worry you." "You shouldn't be up on roofs," she said. "Someone has to fix the flashing." "Not necessarily today from the roof, while I'm standing below counting the ways you could fall." He looked at her and the expression on his face was doing something complicated and gentle. "You were counting," he said, "the ways I could fall." "Don't read into that," she said. "Too late," he said quietly. She stepped back. She needed the distance. "Come inside," she said. "I'll make coffee." He followed her inside, and while she made coffee at the stove, she could feel him sitting at the kitchen table watching her, and the kitchen that had been her solitary domain for so long felt different with him in it, full in a way that was not uncomfortable. Simply full. October arrived in Dusty Creek with cold nights and days of blinding clarity, the sky hard and blue above the desert. The sage turned silver green and the cottonwoods along the dry creek bed that gave the town its name turned gold. Annie had the best run of guests in the fall, travelers in a hurry, moving through quickly, easy to accommodate. The house was never empty but never overwhelming, and for the first time in 2 years she sometimes had a quiet afternoon, a pocket of unhurried time, and she was learning what to do with it. She drew. She read. Once, on a warm October afternoon when Aaron was in town buying supplies, she took off her boots and sat on the back steps with her bare feet on the warm ground and did absolutely nothing for 20 minutes, and this was so radical an act that she sat with it afterward and tried to locate any guilt and found surprisingly little. She was beginning, cautiously, to learn the shape of what she wanted. It was different from what she did. It overlapped with it in places. She genuinely loved to cook, not the necessity of it but the craft, the transformation of raw things into something nourishing and good. She loved her house, the substance of it, the rooms she knew like her own hands. She loved the mountains and the desert light. She loved the sketchbook that was now half filled with pages she had made solely for herself, and she was learning, with some difficulty, that she loved Aaron Malone. She said the word to herself in private first, in the way you try a new word in a language you're just learning to see whether it fits. Sitting on the back steps one evening with her coffee, looking at the last light on the mountains. "I love him." It fit. It fit with a precision and a rightness that was both exhilarating and terrifying, the way anything true felt when you finally stopped avoiding it. She did not say it to him, not yet, but she thought he might know anyway. There was a quality to the way she moved in a room where he was, a specific attentiveness, an awareness of his presence as a kind of weather that she was always tracking. She thought he tracked her the same way. She thought they had been tracking each other for weeks, and that this tracking was its own language, one they had been speaking in without yet putting words to it. On the second Sunday of October, 1 month and 1 week after the evening he had made his tentative first proposal, Aaron was doing the accounts at the writing desk in the sitting room, and Annie was in the armchair with her sketchbook when she put down her pencil and said, "Ask me again." He set down his pen and turned in the chair to look at her. "A month," she said. "You said ask again in a month. It's been a month and a week." He was very still. "I'm asking," he said. "Then the answer is yes," she said. "The answer is yes to all of it, to whatever this is and whatever it becomes." She pressed her hands flat on the sketchbook in her lap. "I want this. I want you. I want—" She stopped and laughed a little unsteady. "I want to figure out who I am outside of what I do, and I want you to be here while I do it. That's what I want." He stood up from the desk and crossed the sitting room in 3 steps, and he took her hands from the sketchbook and held them in both of his. And he looked at her with everything in his face open and unhidden, and he said, "That is the best thing anyone has ever said to me." "Don't make me cry," she said. "I'll do my best," he said. He raised her hands and kissed her knuckles, her right hand and then her left, and she felt it everywhere, a warmth spreading from those 2 small points of contact to fill her chest, her throat, the backs of her eyes. "I'm going to court you properly," he said. "I want to do this right. I want to take you to dinner, not food you cooked yourself. I want to take you riding, somewhere you haven't been in a while because there's always something to do here. I want to sit with you and do nothing and let you be a person who is not working." He looked at her. "I know you don't entirely know how to be that person yet. I'm patient." "Aaron," she said. "Yes." "Stop planning," she said. "Just for a minute." He stopped. She reached up and put her hand against his jaw, the one with the week-old beard that was becoming more of a month-old beard, and she felt him go very still under her touch. She held his face in her hand and looked at him and felt the realness of it, the solid, warm weight of his face against her palm, and she thought, This is what wanting something for yourself feels like, this precise thing." He covered her hand with his. He turned his face slightly, just slightly, to press his lips against her palm, and she closed her eyes. They stayed like that for a while, in the quiet October sitting room with the lamp burning and the desert night coming in cold against the windows, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was, in fact, the most she had felt in a room in a very long time. He proposed formally in November. Not at the boarding house. He took her, as promised, to dinner at the hotel dining room at the far end of Dusty Creek's Main Street, which had a tablecloth and candles, and a cook who had at some point in his life worked in a San Francisco kitchen, and had not quite recovered from the experience. Aaron wore a clean shirt and a coat that had been carefully brushed, and Annie wore her green dress, the good one she kept for occasions she rarely had, and she felt the strangeness of being in public with him as something other than an innkeeper with a guest. The strangeness of being a woman at a dinner table with a man who was looking at her like she was the reason he had ridden to Nevada. They ate and they talked, and the dinner was better than she had expected, and the conversation was easy and warm and occasionally funny in the way their conversations usually were. And over the coffee and the apple pie he reached into his coat pocket and set a small item on the table between them. It was a ring, a simple gold ring with a small pale garnet set in it. Not extravagant, nothing that made a spectacle of itself. Pretty in the way that simple things are pretty. "That was my mother's," he said. "My sister had it after her. My sister wrote me last spring and sent it back. She said she didn't need it and she thought I'd know what to do with it when the time came." He looked at the ring. "I didn't think I'd need it so soon, but here we are." Annie looked at the ring on the table. "Annie Covington," he said. "Will you marry me? Not because I want someone to run this house. Not because you need someone to take care of you, though I will if you'll let me. but because I would like to spend my life with a woman who weeps when someone asks her what she wants, and then answers the question anyway. Because I think you're the most honest and capable and tender-hearted person I've ever met, and I've been looking at you for 3 months, and I can't imagine looking anywhere else." She looked at the ring for a moment more. Then she picked it up and put it on her finger. "Yes," she said. She looked up at him. "Yes." He reached across the table and took her hand, the one with the ring, and held it. His expression was not triumphant. It was something much quieter and better than triumph. It was settled. It was certain. It looked the way a man looked who had been traveling a very long time and had finally arrived somewhere. She felt the same way. They were married in December at the little church that was also a schoolhouse, on a Saturday morning when the desert air was cold and brilliant, and the mountains showed a dusting of snow on their highest ridges. The minister was a gentle old man named Reverend Hale, who had been in Dusty Creek almost as long as the town itself, and who married couples with a directness and warmth that made the ceremony feel like something true rather than something formal. There were not many guests. Dutch from the livery, who had taken a shine to Aaron in the way of men who admired good horse management. Mrs. Radnor from across the street, who wept into her handkerchief with great enthusiasm. 2 or 3 townspeople who came because weddings were events in a town this size, regardless of their personal connection. Clara, the woman who had passed through in September, had left a note when she departed that said, simply, "I hope by the time you read this you have the sense to say yes to him." Annie had kept the note. She wore the green dress again, with her hair done more carefully than usual, and Aaron wore his best coat, which was not particularly fine but which he wore with the straight-shouldered ease of a man who was not embarrassed by plain things, and she thought he was the most handsome person she had ever seen, and she was not embarrassed by thinking so. When Reverend Hale said the words and Aaron said his, he looked at her the whole time. Not at the Reverend, not at the church, not at the floor. At her, as though she were the only thing in the room, as though this moment were something he wanted to see completely without looking away. She said her own words back and her voice didn't shake, which surprised her because she was feeling a great deal. But the steadiness was there, the same steadiness that had gotten her through every early morning and difficult account and lonely evening of the last 2 years, except this time it was not braced against anything. It was just hers. She was steady because she was certain. When he kissed her, someone, she suspected Dutch, clapped, and Reverend Hale smiled, and Annie kept her eyes open for a moment too long and saw the mountains through the church's small window and thought, "I will draw them differently now. I will draw them from a different place." The first winter of their marriage was the kind that teaches you the shape of a life. Aaron's days had a new structure. He had written to the Carson City job and declined politely, citing changed circumstances. He had written to several smaller cattle associations in the Nevada region about possible consulting work, the kind of work that would take him away occasionally but not permanently, and which he was honest with Annie about from the start. She had been honest back. She did not want a husband who was gone for months at a time, but she understood the nature of his work and his skills, and she would not ask him to be something other than what he was. What she asked was that he always come back. He always came back. He did the accounts every Sunday. He helped with the heavier maintenance. He was, she discovered with some delight, an excellent cook for 3 specific things: a Texas-style beef stew, a very good cornbread, and a cup of coffee that was somehow reliably better than hers despite using the same beans and the same pot. She told him the cornbread was better than anything she could make, and he said that was the one skill he'd been reliably taught, and she told him he should make it every week, and he did. She drew every day. Not for hours, the boarding house still needed running. That was simply fact, but for an hour in the early morning before guests were up, while Aaron did the first light chores in the stable yard. She drew the mountains and the desert and the town and the people who passed through, and her sketchbook filled, and she bought another. And the drawings got better in the way that things get better when they are done with regularity and love. She showed him every drawing. Not seeking approval, She had stopped needing approval for this particular thing in a way that was one of the clearest signs of some deeper healing, but because she wanted to share them. Because they were something that was hers, and he was something that was hers, and showing him her drawings was a way of saying, "Here is the inside of me. Look at how it sees things." He looked at every single one with the same quality of attention. He had favorites. He told her which ones and why. He had a particular love for the drawings of Bishop the horse, which she found very touching and told him was vanity by proxy. By the following spring they had settled into a life that had a shape Annie had not been able to imagine for herself a year before. The boarding house ran well. They had their routines, their rhythms, the comfortable vocabulary of a shared daily life. They argued occasionally, in the way people who care about things argue, about the winter wood supply, about whether a loose shutter required immediate or eventual repair. Once, significantly, about whether Aaron had been reckless in accepting an investigative job that involved a man with a known short temper, which ended with Aaron acknowledging that she was right and Annie acknowledging that she had been frightened rather than simply critical. And both of them finding that this honesty made the argument resolve faster and cleaner than either of them had expected. She wrote her father's name in the house ledger in the front, in the place where he had written his own name and she had written hers after him. She wrote, "Annie and Aaron Malone, proprietors." She looked at it for a while after she wrote it. Then she showed it to Aaron and he looked at it with the expression she loved best in him, the quiet one that sat in his eyes and didn't need to announce itself. In August of that year, Annie told him she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen in the early morning before the guests were up. She had known for 3 weeks and had waited until she was certain, and now she was certain. She told him simply, standing at the stove with her coffee, and watched his face. He set down his own coffee and stood very still for a moment. Then he crossed the kitchen and took her face in both hands very gently and looked at her for a long moment. His eyes were bright. "Are you well?" he asked. "I'm well," she said. "I'm more than well." He kissed her forehead. Then he kept his forehead pressed against hers, and they stood like that in the kitchen, with the morning coming in through the window, and the coffee going cold, and neither of them saying anything, because there was nothing to say that could improve on this particular silence. "I'm going to have to manage the roof repairs before October," he said finally. She laughed so hard she almost spilled the coffee. The baby came the following March, after a labor that was long and exhausting and attended by the town's doctor, a steady-handed woman named Dr. Frances Howell, who had come to Dusty Creek 2 years prior, and whom Annie had immediately liked. Dr. Howell was practical and calm, and she did not treat women as though their pain were something to be minimized or their competence to be doubted, and for this Annie was profoundly grateful. The baby was a boy. He arrived at 4 in the morning, the hour that had always been Annie's alone, the hour of lit fires and cold dark kitchens and solitary coffee, and now he arrived into it and made it different forever. Aaron was there. He stayed the whole time, and he held her hand during the parts that required hand-holding, and he stayed out of the way during the parts that required getting out of the way. And when the baby was finally placed in his arms, he held him with the same careful precision with which he did all physical things, and he looked down at the small, wrinkled, furiously disgruntled face of his son with an expression that undid Annie completely. "Hello," he said to the baby, very quietly. Just that word. "What are we going to call him?" Annie said from the exhausted depth of the bed. "I thought about Clement," Aaron said, "for your father." She hadn't expected that. She pressed her lips together and held on. "Clement," she said. "Clement Malone." "Clem," Aaron said to the baby. "That's who you are." Clem seemed to find this information unremarkable and went directly to sleep, which Dr. Howell said was an excellent sign of a sensible temperament. The years moved forward in the way years do when they are good years, when the days are full and the nights are warm and the work is difficult but not desperate. They are not slow and they are not fast. They are simply present and then they are remembered. The boarding house did well. Nevada was a state that needed rest stops, that needed the commerce of travelers, and Dusty Creek sat on a route that enough people used to keep 4 rooms busy most of the year. Annie ran the house. Aaron managed the accounts and the heavy repairs and occasional consulting work that kept him gone 2 or 3 weeks at a time and home again reliably, always home again. He always came home with something from wherever he'd been, not expensive things, just things he'd seen and thought she'd want to know about. A piece of interesting stone, a newspaper with a strange story. Once from a town that had a proper art supply shop, a small set of oil paints and 3 brushes, which arrived in her hands with a note that said, "In case you ever want more than pencil." She had held that package and cried, and he had pretended not to notice, and she had told him to stop pretending not to notice, and he had put his arm around her and she had cried properly. Clem grew. He was a sunny, energetic child who adored the horses and tormented the stable cat, and had his father's dark hair and his mother's brown eyes, and a particular smile that was entirely his own. He showed an early and relentless interest in the account ledger, which amused both his parents considerably, and by the time he was 5, he could identify the difference between a debit and a credit, which Aaron considered a triumph. When Clem was 3, Annie found herself in the kitchen one early morning looking at the second sketchbook, the one she'd finished in the first year, and thinking about the drawings in it. She had been approached twice by people who had seen her work. Once by a traveling art dealer passing through who had seen a drawing she'd done of the Main Street hanging in the sitting room, and once by Mrs. Radnor, who had wanted a portrait of her late husband from a photograph. She had said no both times reflexively, the same reflex that had once made her say it's nothing and it's just a sketch and I don't know if it's useful. She mentioned this to Aaron one evening. "Do you want to sell your work?" he asked. She thought about it honestly. "I don't know," she said. "I don't know if I want it to be work. It's mine in a different way than the house is mine. I don't know if I want a price on it." "Then don't put one," he said. "The art dealer was coming through once. You don't have to decide anything. But Mrs. Radnor is your neighbor and your friend, and she would understand no perfectly well." "She would," Annie agreed. "She is very gracious about being told no." "You could also say yes," Aaron said. "If you wanted to, if the portrait sounded like something you wanted to do, not something you felt obligated to do. Those are different things." She looked at him. He was doing that thing he did, not pushing, not steering, just holding the space open so she could figure out what she actually wanted without someone else's preference filling it up. She did the portrait. She told Mrs. Radnor it was a gift, not a commission. She spent 2 evenings on it, and it came out better than she expected, better than the photograph, truer somehow, because she had put something of herself into the rendering of the old man's face. Mrs. Radnor wept when she received it and told Annie she was the most talented woman in Nevada. "She's not wrong," Aaron said when she told him. "You're extremely biased," she said. "Completely," he agreed. "Doesn't make it untrue." Their second child came when Clem was 4. Another boy, smaller than his brother but louder, a fact he announced immediately and emphatically at birth. They named him James, for Aaron's father, who had died the year before, and whom Aaron had gone back to Texas to bury, a trip that had been hard and quiet-making, and from which he had returned with a particular kind of settled sadness that gradually lifted over the following months. James was his brother's opposite in temperament. Where Clem was calm and interested and precise, James was energetic and expansive and interested in everything simultaneously and loudly. He adored his brother and his father, and was completely clear-eyed about the fact that his mother was the most important person in his universe, a position she held with a mixture of exhaustion and delight. With 2 small children in the house, Annie's hour in the early morning became more precious than ever. Aaron defended it with a consistency that she found extraordinary. On mornings when James was fussy or Clem was awake early and wanting attention, Aaron was the one who appeared in the kitchen doorway first before Annie could put down her pencil and said, "I've got them. You keep going." She kept going. The sketchbooks accumulated on the shelf in the sitting room. 8 of them now 9, 10. She had started doing larger work on sheets of proper paper she ordered from a supplier in Carson City. The oil paints had been used and replenished twice. The mountains outside the boarding house kitchen window had been rendered in every season and every light, in pencil and in oil, and they were different every time because she was different every time, and this was something she understood now in a way she had not known to understand when she was 26, and the wanting had been sealed up so long it came out in a flood. It still came out sometimes, not always as grief or loss, sometimes as joy, which surprised her equally. The sight of James laughing at something his brother had done, the smell of the cornbread Aaron made every week, the particular quality of the late afternoon light in October when it lay gold and low across the desert floor and made everything look as though it were lit from within. These things could still make tears rise in her, and she had stopped being embarrassed by them. "You still cry," Clem said once, watching her at the kitchen window with something clearly going on in her eyes. "I do," she said. "Papa says you keep your feelings close to the surface," Clem said, with the precision of a child reporting something heard and memorized. "He said that." "He said it was one of the things he loved best about you," Clem said, with the complete guilelessness of a child who does not yet understand that he is passing on tender information. Annie wiped her eyes and looked out the window at Aaron, who was in the stable yard with James perched on his shoulders, both of them examining something about the fence line with great seriousness. She watched them for a while, and the ordinary beauty of it moved through her like a current. Dusty Creek changed around them over those years, as towns in the Nevada desert changed, sometimes growing, sometimes contracting, always with a kind of provisional quality, as though the desert might at any point reclaim it. The silver boom that had fueled the region's early growth began to ebb by the mid-1880s, and some businesses closed and some families left for California or Colorado. But the boarding house remained steady. Travelers still needed beds. The route through town stayed active. Annie and Aaron made practical adjustments, adding a fifth room when Clem and James were old enough to share, learning the particular economics of a business tied to travel patterns, which was not unlike, Aaron noted once, range detective work in the sense that everything depended on knowing the landscape. He had mostly retired from range detective work by then, doing occasional consulting that was genuinely occasional, twice in a year at most, and close enough to home that he was gone 2 weeks rather than 2 months. He had put money away carefully over the years of his work, enough that the boarding house's lean periods were manageable, enough that when the roof needed a full replacement, rather than a repair, they could do it without catastrophe. One afternoon in the spring of 1887, 9 years after Aaron Malone had ridden into Dusty Creek on a Thursday with a loose shoe on his horse, and a week's worth of beard, and an open, unhurried attention, Annie sat on the back steps of the boarding house with her sketchbook in her lap. The boys were at school, the schoolhouse that was also the church, where they went 6 days a week with the kind of philosophical acceptance of children who don't know any other way. Aaron was inside doing the accounts, which he had done without complaint for 9 years, and the faint sound of the pen moving in the ledger was audible through the open kitchen window. Annie was drawing the mountains. She had drawn these mountains hundreds of times. She knew every ridge and shadow, every place where the snow sat in spring and melted by June, every rock formation that caught the morning light in a specific way. She drew them differently every time because she saw them differently every time, because she herself was different, and the seeing was always a function of the seer. She drew the mountains and she thought about 26-year-old Annie Covington, who had stood at this same kitchen window and felt hollow and couldn't name the wanting. She thought about the morning she had come downstairs and found the fire already lit. She thought about a cup of coffee at 4 in the morning, and a question so simple it had cracked something open. What would you stop doing if you could stop anything? She thought about weeping at a kitchen table and how that had not been weakness but an opening, a door swinging wide on something that had been shut for too long. She thought about Aaron on the step below her on the back stoop, his hat in his hands, looking at the mountains, saying, "I've been riding toward something for 7 years without knowing what it was." She looked at the mountains now in the late morning light and she felt full. Not the taut, precarious fullness of obligation and task and no one else to do it. The other kind. The kind that comes from being genuinely present in a life you have chosen, with a person you have chosen, in a place that is yours in every sense of the word. The kitchen door opened and Aaron came out with 2 cups of coffee and sat down beside her on the steps, on the same step now, not the one below, because that particular kind of distance had long since become unnecessary. He handed her a cup. He looked at the sketchbook. "The mountains again," he said. "Still," she corrected. He looked at the mountains. He turned his coffee cup in his hands, the old habit, the one she had catalogued in the first week and had never stopped finding affectionate. "Clem was asking me last night about the ranch," he said. "The theoretical ranch," she said. "Perhaps less theoretical than it used to be," he said. "There's a piece of land 6 miles north. Hendricks is selling. Good grass, water rights on the creek, not much on it yet, but the bones are right." She turned to look at him. "Are you serious?" "I've been thinking about it for a year," he said. "I didn't want to say anything until I was sure it made sense." "It makes sense," he looked at her. "We wouldn't leave the boarding house. I'd never ask you to leave this place. But the land would be ours, something to build on, something for Clem and James when they're grown if they want it." He paused. "Something I could put my name on, alongside yours." She looked at him for a long moment, at this man who had ridden into her town 9 years ago and asked her what she wanted and held still while she answered, who had lit her fire and done her accounts and defended her mornings and named their firstborn son for her father, who had never once made her feel like a mechanism. "Yes," she said. "Let's do it." He smiled, and it was the full smile, the one that had surprised her the first time she saw it in the early morning lamplight of her kitchen. And it still did what it had always done to her, still landed somewhere warm and certain in the middle of her chest. She leaned her head against his shoulder, which was something she had started doing in the first winter of their marriage and had never stopped. He put his arm around her. They sat on the back steps of the Covington boarding house in the spring morning with their coffee and the mountains and the sound of the desert and the whole of their life arranged around them. And the shape of it was not what she had imagined for herself when she was young, because she had not been able to imagine for herself when she was young. She had only been able to execute what was needed, but this was what she wanted. She opened her sketchbook to a fresh page and drew the horizon line with a single pencil stroke, sure and clean and unbroken. Below it she wrote, in very small letters in the corner of the page, something she did not show Aaron until much later that evening, when the boys were asleep and the house was quiet and the lamp was burning warm between them in the sitting room, when she handed him the sketchbook and watched his face as he read. "What I wanted," she had written. "This." He looked up from the page. His eyes were bright. "You're going to make me cry now," he said. "Good," she said. "It's your turn." He laughed. She laughed. The lamp burned. Outside, the Nevada night was cold and full of stars, and the mountains stood where they had always stood, patient and enormous and lit from within by something that had nothing to do with the sun. The land north of town was purchased that autumn. Aaron spent 2 years building the ranch slowly and carefully, the way he did everything, not rushing it into being but letting it take the shape it needed to take. A house first, simple and solid, properly built to last in the desert climate. A barn. A corral. A small kitchen garden that Annie planted herself in the spring, and which produced, in its first full year, more tomatoes than 2 adults and 2 growing boys could reasonably consume, a fact that delighted everyone. Clem, who was 9 when the building began, took to the ranch with the quiet, systematic interest that characterized everything he did. He learned the cattle with his father. He kept the first ranch account ledger himself, in a hand that was already precise and clear, and he showed it to his father every Sunday with a solemnity that made Aaron catch Annie's eye over the boy's head with an expression of pure delight. James was louder about the ranch and equally devoted to it, in the way he was louder and equally devoted to everything. He was the first one in the corral every morning and the last one out, and he could coax a difficult horse into gentleness with a patience that was surprising in such an energetic child. "He has your hands," Aaron told Annie once, watching James work with a young mare. "Look at how careful he is." Annie looked at her son's hands, guiding the mare with steady confidence, and felt something so large and particular move through her that she had to look away at the mountains for a moment to contain it. The boarding house continued. It would always continue. Annie ran it with the same competence she had always had, but the shape of the running was different now. She had helped a girl from town named Rosa who came 3 mornings a week for the laundry and the heavier cleaning, whose presence had been Aaron's suggestion, and which Annie had resisted for months on the familiar grounds of it not being necessary and of her being perfectly capable, and which she had finally accepted when Aaron said, very gently, that being capable of doing something alone did not mean being obligated to, and that accepting help was not the same as failing. She had accepted the help. Rosa was 17 and efficient and had a dry sense of humor that Annie appreciated, and the 3 mornings a week changed the texture of the work considerably, freed up the hours in which Annie drew and painted and occasionally, very occasionally, sold a piece to someone who asked. She had sold 3 paintings now. 2 to travelers, 1 to the postmaster in Carson City who had seen a piece she had on loan in the general store window for a month and had written asking to buy it. She had not priced herself high. She had not priced herself low. She had priced herself fairly, which was the hardest lesson, the one that required believing the work had value. "You should charge more," Aaron said every time. "I'm charging what it's worth to me," she said. "It's worth more than that to everyone else," he said. This was an ongoing negotiation that she suspected would continue for the remainder of their lives and that she did not entirely mind. In the winter of 1891, when Clem was 12 and James was 8, a letter arrived from San Francisco. It was from a woman Annie had never met, a Mrs. Pendleton, who was the wife of a man who had passed through Dusty Creek 3 years prior and stayed at the boarding house for a week, and who had apparently spent part of that week telling his wife about the drawing that hung in the sitting room. Mrs. Pendleton wrote to ask whether Miss Covington, the name by which the boarding house was still known, had more work available for sale, and whether she had considered showing her paintings in San Francisco, where Mrs. Pendleton had connections with a gallery on Kearny Street, and where the market for Western landscape work was, she said, considerably more active than one might expect. Annie read this letter 3 times. Then she handed it to Aaron without a word. He read it. He set it down on the table. He looked at her. "Well," he said. "Well," she said. "San Francisco," he said. "I know. That's a serious gallery," he said. "Kearny Street, that's not a back room in a dry goods store." "I know that too. Annie," he leaned forward. "This is what you've been doing for 13 years. This is not nothing. This is never nothing." She looked at the letter. She looked at her hands. She thought about 26-year-old Annie at the kitchen sink saying it's not useful. She thought about the hollow place that had once moved through her chest and what had filled it, what had been filling it year by year, drawing by drawing, morning by morning. "I'd have to send pieces to her," she said. 3 or 4 pieces. "For her to take to the gallery, on consignment." "Yes," he said, "they might not want them." "They might not," he agreed, "but they might." She looked at him. "You think I should do it?" "I think," he said, "that you should do whatever you want to do and not anything else. That is what I have always thought, but if you're asking me what I believe that those mountains you have been drawing for 13 years deserve to be seen by more than Dusty Creek, Nevada. I believe you deserve to be seen." She pressed both hands flat on the table. Then she picked up the letter and read it one more time. Then she set it down and said, "All right, I'll write to her." She wrote to Mrs. Pendleton. She selected 4 pieces: the large oil of the mountains in October light, a smaller piece of the desert floor in spring, a drawing of Bishop the horse in pencil and charcoal that she had done in the 3rd year of their marriage, and that Aaron privately considered the finest thing she had made, and a recent oil painting of the boys in the corral that she had not originally intended to show to anyone but which was, she had to admit when she looked at it honestly, very good. She wrapped them carefully and sent them west to San Francisco on the stage, and then she went back to her life and her mornings and her kitchen and her family and her mountains, and she tried not to think about it too much. 6 weeks later, a letter came back from Mrs. Pendleton that contained an offer from the Kearny Street Gallery for all 4 pieces, at prices that made Annie sit down at the kitchen table and stare at the paper for a considerable time. Aaron came in from the stable yard and found her sitting there. He read the letter over her shoulder. He said nothing for a moment. Then he went to the shelf where they kept the Sunday bottle of whiskey and he poured 2 glasses and set one in front of her. "Drink that," he said. She drank it. He sat down across from her. "Tell me what you're feeling," he said. "Frightened," she said. "Of what?" She thought about it. "Of it mattering," she said. "I've been doing this in the mornings, and it's been mine, and it's been private, and it's been the thing I do for myself. And if it becomes something that matters to other people, then it becomes a thing I do for other people, and She stopped. "You've been valued for what you could do for a very long time," he said. She looked at him. "This is different," he said. "This is people valuing what you chose to do for yourself. That's not the same thing." She sat with that. She turned the whiskey glass in her hands. She thought about his mother's 43 quilts in the cedar chest and a man who had cried over every one of them. "All right," she said. "I'll accept." She wrote back to Mrs. Pendleton and accepted. The gallery wrote to her directly and sent a bank draft, and Annie stared at the draft for quite a while before she deposited it with the Asher who served as Dusty Creek's nearest thing to a bank. She used part of it to buy a proper easel. Aaron said she should have bought the easel years ago. She told him the timing was exactly right and not 1 day sooner. He said she was probably correct about that. In that particular way, he had of conceding a point that made it feel like an agreement rather than a defeat. She set the easel up in the corner of the sitting room, by the window with the best light, the same window where she had first sat in the armchair with the sketchbook, while Aaron did the accounts across from her. The night she had told him the answer was yes. She stood the easel there and put a fresh canvas on it and stood back and looked at it, and felt, as she looked at it, something so right and complete that she had to sit down. Aaron leaned in the doorway and looked at the easel and then at her. "Beautiful," he said. "It's just an easel." "I know," he said. "I was looking at you." She laughed. He was still the only person who could make her laugh and cry within 20 seconds of each other, and she suspected he would continue to be for the rest of her life, and she found she didn't mind this in the least. Spring came again to Dusty Creek in the way it always did, sudden and extravagant after the cold brown months of winter, the sage greening up, the creek bed flooding briefly with snowmelt from the mountains, the air full of a clarity that felt almost audible. The boarding house filled up with travelers restarting their interrupted journeys, families who had been waiting for passable roads, men heading to and from the silver camps that were diminishing but not yet gone. Annie cooked and ran the house and managed Rose's work schedule, and sat at the breakfast table with her sons every morning, and listened to them argue amiably about things that mattered only to them, and drew in the mornings and painted in the evenings, and rode out with Aaron on Saturday afternoons when there were no guests to manage, the 2 of them on horseback in the open desert with the mountains ahead of them, going nowhere particular, just going. On one such afternoon, a Saturday in late April with the sky the hard good blue of Nevada spring, they had ridden out about 4 miles east of town to a flat-topped sandstone shelf that overlooked a long valley, a place Annie had been drawing since she was a child, and that she had come to think of as hers in a private, interior way that had nothing to do with legal ownership. They sat on the warm rock with their horses tied below, and Annie had her sketchbook open on her knee and Aaron was reading a newspaper that was 2 weeks old, and the valley spread out below them in the afternoon light, everything gold and silver and blue-shadowed, and the silence was the good kind, full and undemanding. She drew the valley. She had drawn it before, many times. Each time she drew it now, there was something in the line that was different from the way she had drawn it before she knew Aaron, before she had learned to want things for herself. Before the morning, she had wept at the kitchen table at 4 a.m. and then answered the question anyway. The difference was this: the line was certain. Not perfect, she did not particularly care about perfect. Certain. It knew what it was and where it was going, and it made no apology for being there. "You look happy," Aaron said from behind his newspaper. "I am," she said. He folded the paper down and looked at her. She was drawing, the pencil moving with that particular certainty she had developed over 14 years of doing this by morning lamplight and late afternoon desert sun. Her hair had come partly loose from its pin, as it always did on horseback, and there was a smudge of pencil on her forearm that she hadn't noticed, and she was looking at the valley below with an expression that was completely unguarded and entirely her own. "So am I," he said. She looked up from the sketchbook and caught him looking at her with the same open, unhurried attention with which he had first looked at her from the back of a roan horse on a Thursday afternoon in 1878, and the looking was still the same, 15 years on. It had not dimmed or habituated or become routine. It was still clear-eyed and real and entirely about her. She held his gaze. She thought about the boarding house behind them, and their sons at school, and the ranch 6 miles north, and the letter in the bureau drawer from a gallery in San Francisco that had sold 2 more of her paintings last fall and was asking for more. She thought about the sketchbooks on the shelf, 13 of them now, and the mornings that were hers, and the hollow place in her chest that was not hollow anymore, that had been filled slowly and deliberately and irrevocably with everything she had allowed herself to want. She thought about a kitchen fire already burning and a box of pencils on a table and a question asked in the early morning with a cup of coffee. What would you stop doing if you could stop anything? "Thank you," she said. He tilted his head slightly. "For what?" "For asking," she said. "That morning in the kitchen what I wanted to stop doing." She looked back at the valley. "You have no idea what that question cost you." "Cost me?" He sounded puzzled. "You were stuck with me afterward," she said. "You asked a woman what she wanted and she wept, and you could have walked away and you didn't, and you've been here ever since." She looked at him, and she was smiling and her eyes were bright. "You're extremely stuck." He set the newspaper down entirely. He looked at her. The corner of his mouth moved. "I am," he said, "completely and entirely stuck." He paused. "Best thing that ever happened to me." She laughed. It rang out over the valley, her laugh, clear and unguarded and real, and the horses shifted below them on the rock, and the sage moved in the low breeze, and the mountains held their old positions against the sky, patient and enormous and unchanged. She put her hand out across the warm sandstone between them. He took it and held it, and the afternoon sat around them like a thing made of light, and Dusty Creek waited for them 4 miles west, with its boarding house and its ranch and its kitchen fire that was always already burning when she came downstairs, and its 2 boys who were their father's precision and their mother's wondering all at once, and its mountains that she would go on drawing until her hands gave out, and its long desert evenings and its brilliant mornings, and the whole wide gorgeous fact of a life chosen and built and kept, day by day, by 2 people who had found in each other what they had not known they were looking for. She drew one more line in the sketchbook. It was true and clear, and it went exactly where she intended. She had always been capable of that. She just hadn't known for a long time that the line could be for her. Now she knew. She closed the sketchbook and held it in her lap and looked at the mountains in the late light, and the mountains looked back. And between Aaron Malone and those mountains there was a long history of seeing, a history of mornings and pencils and oil paint and hours that were hers, and the whole of it was gathered in her hands and her chest and her eyes, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything she had ever wanted once she had been asked.